5 years ago, paper crafting was a $2.5 billion industry. Scrapbooking stores on every high street, Etsy shops making full-time income just selling digital planner pages. A genuine online gold rush. Today, thousands of those stores are gone. Brands that defined the hobby for a decade, ClearSnap, Daris, Consumer Crafts, simply don't exist anymore. And the online side didn't survive any better. In June 2025, a marketplace quietly deleted 7 words from its policy page, and overnight, tens of thousands of digital sellers' entire businesses became a violation. This isn't a story about people falling out of love with paper. It's a story about what happens when a hobby-turned industry gets hit by 3 things at once. A pandemic boom that was never going to last, a platform that changed the rules without warning, and AI tools that let anyone flood the market in seconds. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this industry collapsed and why so many people never saw it coming. Paper crafting split into 2 connected worlds that most outsiders never separated. The physical side, scrapbooking stores, craft chains, and specialty brands selling cardstock, dies, stamps, and embellishments. A hobby with deep roots going back decades, built around physical stores, in-person classes, and a loyal, largely older customer base. The digital side, a newer, internet-native business that exploded through Etsy and similar marketplaces. People selling digital downloads, printable planners, SVG cut files for Cricut machines, digital scrapbook kits, wedding invitation templates. No inventory, no shipping, just a file someone downloads and prints or cuts themselves. For thousands of sellers, this became a genuine income stream, some of it full-time. Both sides fed each other. The rise of home cutting machines like Cricut and Silhouette created enormous demand for digital files to cut. The pandemic then supercharged both sides at once. People stuck at home, rediscovering hobbies, buying craft machines, and a wave of new sellers rushing in to meet that demand. That combination is exactly what set up the collapse. The physical side of this industry had been quietly bleeding for years before most people noticed. Industry commentators tracking the scrapbooking trade have documented a steady drumbeat of closures. ClearSnap, once a major stamping and ink brand, shut down. eCraft Central closed. Consumer Crafts, a well-known online supplier many crafters relied on for bulk purchases, closed its doors. Daris, a decades-old craft supply manufacturer, wound down operations. These weren't small, unknown companies. These were names that had defined shelves in craft stores for years. The pattern repeats across the industry. Brands that scrapbookers had built entire hobbies around simply stopped existing, one after another, without a single dramatic collapse. Just a slow, steady attrition that added up to what one scrapbooking community forum bluntly described as thousands of scrapbooking stores, closing since the industry's mid-2010s peak. The reasons compound on each other. Big box craft retailers consolidated their shelf space toward higher turnover categories. Younger crafters, when they did engage with the hobby, increasingly did it through digital tools rather than buying physical embellishments. And the specialty stores that had survived on a loyal, aging customer base found that base wasn't being replaced at the same rate it was leaving. While physical stores were fading, the online side looked like it was thriving for a while. Digital download sellers on Etsy built real businesses around planner pages, SVG files, and printable art. Entire how to sell printables on Etsy course industries sprang up around teaching people how to replicate that success. It genuinely worked for a meaningful stretch of the pandemic, years and after. Low overhead, scalable, no physical inventory risk. But that same low barrier to entry became the seed of the collapse. As generative AI tools became widely available, the cost of producing a digital printable collapsed from hours of design work to seconds of prompting. Sellers who once spent real time designing original planner layouts or SVG files found themselves competing against a flood of AI-generated listings, produced at a volume no individual designer could match. Craft industry press covering this shift described designers and illustrators watching their own pricing get undercut by sellers using generative AI to mass-produce listings. The exact language used was that prices were being undercut by a wave of AI-assisted competition that hadn't existed a few years earlier. For a seller whose entire business model depended on being one of a manageable number of listings in a search category, suddenly competing against thousands of near-instant AI-generated alternatives was existential. Here's the part of this story that hit hardest and fastest. On June 10, 2025, the marketplace at the center of this entire digital economy quietly edited its seller policy. The old rule allowed listings based on a seller's original design or using a templated design or pattern. The new rule simply said items must be based on a seller's original design. 7 words were removed. There was no announcement, no email to sellers, no grace period. Overnight, an enormous portion of the printable and SVG selling economy, businesses built specifically around templated designs, common patterns, and widely used formats, found themselves on the wrong side of a rule that had changed without warning. Sellers who'd built years of listings around templates now faced the risk of having their shops flagged or removed for practices that had been completely acceptable the day before. This is the mechanism that makes this story different from a simple "AI took the jobs" narrative. It wasn't just competition from AI-generated content flooding the market, it was the platform itself tightening enforcement at exactly the same moment, going after the very business model thousands of sellers had built their income around. 2 separate pressures, landing in the same 18-month window on an industry that had no single trade body or safety net to absorb either shock, let alone both. If you weren't inside this industry, you probably never noticed any of this happening. That's part of what makes it worth understanding. There was no single dramatic headline moment, no papercraft industry collapses front page. It happened in fragments. A beloved brand's website quietly going dark, a seller's Etsy shop losing half its traffic in a month with no explanation, a scrapbooking store's everything must go sale that nobody outside the hobby paid attention to. Each individual closure looked like an isolated business failure. Only looking at the pattern across years, the way an industry historically valued at $2.5 billion has shed thousands of storefronts, in the words of the community itself, does the scale become visible. That's true of a lot of hobby-adjacent industries built on passionate, dedicated, but relatively small communities. The collapse is real and severe to the people inside it, and almost invisible to everyone else, because there's no single company big enough or newsworthy enough for its decline to make national headlines on its own. Not everyone in this space collapsed, and the pattern of who survived is instructive. Larger, better capitalized platforms like scrapbook.com have continued running large-scale virtual events, live classes with named instructors, and a wide catalog, surviving in part by leaning into community and education rather than competing purely on product volume. On the marketplace side, more recent guidance to sellers has pushed hard toward specificity and originality, hyper-specific niches, genuine handmade storytelling, and designs that couldn't be trivially replicated by a generic AI prompt, as the surviving strategy in a marketplace that's explicitly cracking down on generic, templated, or unmodified AI output. In other words, the sellers and brands that survived weren't necessarily the biggest. They were the ones whose product couldn't be instantly, cheaply replicated by the exact forces that gutted the rest of the industry. Genuine handmade craft, specific enough community trust, or a brand relationship deep enough that customers cared where the product actually came from. Step back and paper crafting's collapse is really a preview of a much bigger story. A hobby industry, quietly worth billions, sat on 2 vulnerabilities most of its participants never thought about until it was too late. A physical retail model that depended on foot traffic and loyalty that wasn't being replenished, and a digital model built on a platform's rules that could change, without warning, in a single afternoon. When AI-driven content flooding and unannounced policy shifts hit at the same time, there was no cushion built in, because nobody selling planner pages or cutting files thought of themselves as working in an industry fragile enough to need one. That's the real lesson, sitting underneath the paper crafting story. It's not really about paper at all. It's about what happens to any small, passionate, internet-built economy when the platform it depends on can rewrite the rules overnight, and when the thing that made it accessible to sell, low cost, low barrier to entry, is exactly what makes it just as easy for someone or something else to flood.